First of all, I discovered you not so. It's pretty recent. It was when you were on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I already was a fan of I'd say anti-aging research, and I liked a lot of David Sinclair's work and people like that. Also, the work on metformin that Nir Barzilai is doing, and I was very excited about the TAME study, and I wanted to talk to you about that later. But and the first thing that made me love you is that I love beer and I love whiskey. And on this podcast, I don't know if you remember that, but Joe Rogan offers you a beer, and the first thing he says afterwards is, "Do you want a Heineken?" And the first thing you tell him is, "No, Heineken is not beer for me." And I'm. It's like my leitmotiv. I keep telling my friends every time I offer them a beer, and they say, "Yeah, give me a Heineken." I'm trying to explain to them why it's not beer. Then he offers you a pretty terrible American whiskey on ice, and you all immediately correct him again. Say, you don't drink American whiskey, and you don't put ice in your whiskey, which is pretty obvious for anybody that loves whiskey. And uh, at this moment, I say, okay, this guy is supposed to be an anti-aging researcher, and you have this cliche of the anti-aging researchers that make everything. I mean, David Sinclair has 18 bio trackers on him, tests his saliva every 3 months, and makes tens adjustments in his nutrition per week to try to measure the effect and things like that. And basically, what you were saying is, well, I don't care because I'm pretty young biologically, and so I don't feel like I'm forced to do everything. And this was like a shock to me because until that very moment, I was in the same let's say mindset as David Sinclair. Oh, yeah, I have to make to be careful to everything I make, and try to slow down my aging at best. And basically the whole podcast after that was a mind-blowing moment for me because it was really a shift in my view of the aging phenomenon. And sorry for the long introduction, but that I wanted to let you know why I wanted to talk with you, because it's for me you're like an out of the box thinker, and it's very important to talk with people like that, I think. So
So, actually,
yeah,
before you go on, I would like
yeah,
to
yeah.
comment a little bit about what you last said because, um, it's not just that I'm still quite young, or even that I'm still quite biologically young, which is true. I have had my biological age tested in various ways over the past 20 years, maybe half a dozen times, and I'm doing very well. So, yes, it's true. If it isn't broken, don't fix it, they say in English.
Mm-hmm.
And so I basically do the same as I normally do. But it's very important to emphasize that everybody is different. So, yes,
Sure.
I mean, perhaps I have a higher alcohol tolerance than the typical American or something like that.
Mm,
But also, it's very important to remember that there's a trade-off here for me that doesn't really apply to most people. I
sure.
am trying, obviously, to bring forward the defeat of aging. And even if I think about that only in terms of whether I personally will benefit from my own work, nevertheless, I have to think in terms of how efficient and effective I am.
Mm,
And if I find that, it's better for me psychologically to live the way I like to live and to be, relaxed and non-stressed so that I can work effectively, then I may be kind of, it may be a net win, even if I am slightly shortening my life by drinking
yeah.
more. Right? Yeah. So it
So
doesn't
you
really
take a
apply.
little risk, but it's a measured one. Yeah.
It's a measured one, that's right, and it's different than it is for people who are
Yeah,
not in
sure.
my position.
Yeah, I understand that. So I wanted to dive in a little bit, and um, uh, when I started thinking about aging, the first time I really started to think about that, uh, the first thing that came up to my mind was it's an entropy problem. So basically, disorder can only grow, and there is no reason our body won't obey to the same laws as the entire universe. And so basically, something must be going that yeah, processes cannot repeat as effectively in time, and then it starts to crumble and then you get old and you die. And I was really thinking about that, but I had absolutely no knowledge of how aging work and everything, so I was very focused on the physics of it. And then I heard you talk about an engineering problem. And you keep saying in all these videos that basically the medical community has been making a huge mistake, thinking like thinking about aging like something out of reach because it's like a natural thing that you cannot grasp. I mean, you cannot deal with it because it's out of reach. And I found it was very contradictory from them, because on one hand they say, well, it's out of reach, it's some kind of natural phenomenon that you cannot deal with. And on the other hand, when you tell them, okay, so let's try to approach it as an engineering problem as you do, and to try to fix it with technology, and you do a lot of this distinction in between technology and medicine and things, they start to, oh my god, no, it's not an engineering problem. It's like they want both sides of the argument, right? They want it not to be uh, deal, dealable, I don't know if it's English, with medicine, but they don't want you to work on it as an engineer either. So what do you think about this contradiction?
You- I think you have it very much right that people who work in biology, in fact, people who work in basic science, they are focused on understanding nature and not so much on manipulating nature. Now, in medicine, you are kind of trying to manipulate nature, right? But you are working with a system, namely the human body, that you know that you don't understand, okay,
Mhm.
that you have a very, very, very poor understanding of. And most people who are in medical research think about that as kind of they can think of it in a kind of a defeatist way, I would say. They say, well, okay, let us try to do what we can, and let us just accept that there is an awful lot that we can't change.
Mhm.
And aging is kind of at the center of that. Aging is kind of, so mysterious to most medical researchers, or it has been anyway, that they just say, well, okay, let's just forget about that. Let's just tinker around the edges. And I guess that's a large part of why I have the definition of aging that I tend to use so much with
Yeah.
these two processes, because the purpose there is to demystify aging, to get people to understand that it's actually pretty easy to understand what aging is in the abstract, and then to drill down from there into the specifics of what's really going on at the molecular level and the cellular level.
Mhm.
But my definition of aging is not in any way contradictory to other definitions that other people use. It just has that more, I think, it has greater utility.
Okay, I see. Um, Before we keep on that subject, I wanted to make you listen to something. I don't know if you heard it. I There is a guy I like a lot out there, uh, and maybe it's probably you know him. It's Brett Weinstein, and I think he's very interesting on many topics. And I was a little disappointed by him a few weeks ago because I asked him something about your work, and I wanted to make you listen to his answer, and to then comment on his argument on why for him what you are doing is useless and cannot work. Okay, so I'll just share the sound of my computer here and make you listen to that.
Aubrey was selling you a bill of goods. Aubrey has brought
Can you
good to the
hear it?
world, but
Okay.
by and large, his line about this is an engineering problem, let's just solve it, is nonsense. It can't work. There are lots of engineering problems that one can specify that are intractable. This happens to be one for reasons we know. So let's just say that the very problem that you want to solve in this case has a downside that you will invite if in fact you solved it. And even if Aubrey was right in all of his categories of things that you have to solve in order to beat this, there's another one lurking right behind it, right? Which is, do you really want to have a 20-year-old body with a 90-year-old brain, right? We don't have a clue how to fix the informational problem that comes from having a brain that was built for 80 years of life and the fact that you might extend it indefinitely. In other words, you'd have to do a whole lot more forgetting in order to get that thing to work. And we just don't have a system that works that way, nor would you be a functional person if your brain was upgraded to work that way or downgraded or whatever it would have to be. And then, if you even take those two critiques, the problem that he says is tractable isn't. Even if it was, the brain issue right behind it is devastating to anything. There's no life that you would want to live that would be the result of having solved all of the mechanistic cellular stuff. But then there's this other problem, which is who knows what pathologies would emerge if you were able to live to 150? Do you know why we don't know? Because nobody ever lives to 150. So the point is, selection has had no ability to clean up the life after the maximum human longevity. So therefore, what you've got is basically an invitation to new pathologies that are liable to be extreme and so numerous there's nothing to do anything about. So yeah, I'm not a fan of this style of thinking. I think it is a waste of time and money. And the reason it is a waste of time and money is that you could take the same money and the same time and you could invest it in extending average lifespan rather than maximum lifespan, and we would make great gains. We know that because we already do make great gains. We've greatly increased maximum longevity. We've basically extended youth, and we could extend that to more people or do an even better job of it. So anyway, yeah, it's a bill of goods, and I guess there's nothing to be done about it because fountains of youth are very attractive, even if they're, and that's where we are.
Okay, so that's it. Before you respond, I just wanted to say that the criticism in his answer is pretty common, right? I've heard you address it in different ways before, but maybe can you answer specifically to what he said here?
Yeah. So Brett ought to, Brett ought to talk to me more before he forms his opinions. And he's not the only one, of course. Actually, he is more or less the only one now. 15 years ago, a lot of people, including Brett, had the habit of thinking they understood what I was saying and telling everybody that it was wrong without actually understanding what I was saying. So yeah, it's a bit disappointing that there are still people who are doing that. But anyway, yes. So first of all, with regard to the brain, of course, Brett is completely right that there is no point in rejuvenating the body unless we can also rejuvenate the brain. In fact, arguably, the brain is more important than the rest of the body.
Mhm.
So certainly that's true. And the way I normally address this just superficially is to point out that the brain is made of more or less the same stuff as the rest of the body. It's made of
Mhm.
cells and stuff between cells, and the cells are made of proteins and DNA. And so the types of molecular and cellular damage that accumulate in the brain are very similar to the ones that accumulate elsewhere, and they're absolutely amenable to the same kind of damage repair approaches. So definitely that's the plan.
Mhm.
But then Brett goes on and says the very curious thing that we would have to do a whole lot more forgetting than what we do right now. And he doesn't give any actual reason for why he thinks this.
Mhm.
I think he's completely wrong. I think that by middle age, or perhaps even younger, people are already forgetting things at the same rate that they are learning new things.
Mhm.
And so we're already in equilibrium. It's not as if, unless you do more, unless you accelerate the forgetting process, you will end up, your brain filling up with information. That just like that. I don't know. I have no idea why he thinks that's a problem. That we're
Mhm.
actually continuing to accumulate more information. I don't think we are. Of course, the um, damage that accumulates in the brain, whether it's waste products in Alzheimer's disease, for example, these things progressively diminish our ability to store information
Mhm.
and also to extract the information that is
Yeah.
stored. But in terms of just maintaining the amount of information that a typical middle-aged person has, I'm not aware of any evidence that there's any problem arising there. Now, the second thing that he suggests is that there are going to be more pathologies around the corner as we repair the ones that we already know about. And of course, qualitatively, there's no reason to suppose that he would be wrong. It absolutely makes sense that there would be. But we have to ask a couple of things. We have to ask, first of all, would those pathologies turn up at at an unmanageable rate in terms of, like, per year or per decade that we increase lifespan? Would we have this torrent of new things? And the second thing we have to ask is, how different would those new things be than things that we already see and are already addressing right now? And the answers to both those questions seem to me to be fairly easy to give. And furthermore, the answers are the encouraging ones that we would like to have. So first of all, how rapidly will we come across new things? Well, the reason we can put a kind of lower bound on that, upper bound, I guess, on how rapidly, is because of the variability that already exists in the human population in terms of how long people live. We can very clearly say that if some phenomenon occurs at an age that a lot of people would reach if we fixed a few things. So let's say if we increased average lifespan by 10 years, then a quarter of people would get this new thing. Then that kind of tells us already that in today's world, at least like a few percent of people would already get that thing. We would have already seen it. So I think we can say, at least in the near term, that the number of new therapies that we would see and how soon we would see them in terms of the life extension that would be required in order to see them, it's pretty encouraging. We're not likely to be overwhelmed by it. Furthermore, we have the question of how different these things would be. We certainly have seen over the past 40 years a good number of new types of damage that were identified. But they were all very, very much, similar to ones that we had before. So if I had been giving my, classification of the types of damage in aging in 1982, it would have been the same classification as now. We have not discovered any radically new, different types of damage. They've all fitted very naturally into the same categories. I'm not saying that's certain to be true forever, not at all. But it very much looks as though if something radically new were to come along, it would be a very rare event, and it might never happen at all. Ultimately, we know what the body is made of, and therefore we can pretty much anticipate what could happen in terms of new types of damage that might matter. So, of course, Brett is correct about the lack of selection against these things, but we also have to ask, there's no selection against the things that we already see, because, evolution only works on young people who haven't reproduced yet.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think Brett is just being deeply oversimplistic in his rejection of the engineering approach, the damage repair approach.
Yeah, that's how I felt when I heard his answer, because he didn't even give so many arguments. He just stated things, and basically he fit in this pro-aging trends that you've been talking about so much.
In fairness to Brett, he was probably talking to a general audience, right?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, right. So, you always have to oversimplify a bit.
Yeah.
But the thing is, still, if you're going to give your conclusions, you'd damn well better have actually looked at it in depth in discussion with the people who disagree, the experts who disagree with you, so in this case me, before you become so sure of yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Let's talk about this engineering problem idea. So basically, to make it simple, you made a list of 7 things you need to fix in order to fix aging. And I heard you say a few times that you don't have to fix all of them perfectly, and it's and you use a lot this expression of divide and conquer. And I wanted to ask you, as an engineering problem with 7 kind of problems, and you always you often talk about this old car in your conferences that you repaired, and that is repaired and still works 100 years later. uh, is it possible that solving completely one of the 7 might almost fix one of the others? Because I heard you say you don't have to know every interaction of everything and that's the kind of the beauty of your approach. That it's if it's an engineering problem, all you have to do is understand the problem and how you fix it, and you don't need to understand everything that happens in between. um, do you think it's possible that fixing 1 or 2 of these
Yeah.
may actually increase or maybe improve others of the list?
Okay, so yeah, so let me take that apart a little bit.
Yeah,
So first of all, it's very important to understand I'm not saying there are only 7 types of damage. There are
yeah,
masses and masses of types of damage. What I'm
sure.
saying is that there are only 7 types of repair strategy that we need to use. So what I do with these 7 categories is I'm classifying many, many types of damage into 7 different kind of boxes. And the reason why that's useful is because for each box, for each set of types of damage, there is a generic approach to fixing it. So we have 7 basic paradigms for doing the fixing. Now, what I say about not having to fix everything completely is a little different than the question that you asked at the end. So what I say there is, but basically within each category, or at least within each type of damage, there is kind of additivity. So, for example, let's take stiffening of the extracellular matrix, loss of elasticity. This is something that is caused by various chemical reactions that introduce new chemical bonds between the proteins in the extracellular matrix. And the way to fix it is to break those bonds. Now, those bonds are not all the same as each other. The chemical structure of those bonds falls into various different categories. But each one, contributes the same, each bond contributes the same thing, whatever the structure is. So some of these structures are more abundant than others. In particular, we believe that there's one particular structure that's more abundant than all the others put together. So if we just fix that one, we've solved more than half the problem.
Hmm. Okay, I see.
And we don't have to fix the others yet. It'll be a while before all the others catch up with, the
Hmm.
one that was missing. So then we can kind of fix them later. And this is what leads to this is an illustration of the concept of longevity escape velocity. When I talk about not needing to understand things, that's a different statement from the one I
Hmm.
just gave. Understanding things, it's all about understanding the processes that give rise to damage.
Yeah, sure.
These processes are very deeply intertwined with the processes that keep us alive in the first place, and that's really why slowing aging down, in other words, making the body run more clean. Here, I think really your question is not so much about the individual types of damage, like the individual types of crosslink, for example, but
Mhm.
rather the individual classes, the
Yeah.
categories, right? And here I have become more optimistic over the past decade or so. Originally, I always knew that there would be some degree of crosstalk between the categories. In other words, that if you fix one really well, then you reduce that type of damage, then you will somewhat improve the overall kind of happiness of the body, so to speak, and thereby kind of slow down the rate at which the other types of damage accumulate, even if you are not directly addressing those types of damage at the same time. But I always felt that the magnitude of that crosstalk would be quite modest, though
Mhm.
actually we would not see all that much of a slowdown in the other types of damage if we fixed one. And then the people from the Buck Institute and the Mayo Clinic came along about 10 years ago, and they showed the first proof of concept of what happens if you remove senescent cells, which is one big category. Well, it's kind of half of one big category, really, which I normally call death-resistant cells. And honestly, I was quite surprised at how wide-ranging the benefits were. Now,
Mhm.
of course, that first paper was quite artificial in various ways, but that was fine. That was a great start, and of course, lots more has happened since then. looks like, at least in the case of senescent cells, the magnitude of the crosstalk is a lot bigger than I would have expected beforehand. We seem to see widespread benefits. So that's great news, of course. It's fantastic. It means that we we can probably get to longevity escape velocity with a more incomplete
Yeah.
panel of interventions than I would otherwise have expected. Now, of course, we don't know that the same thing is going to apply for the next type of damage that we succeed in fixing, but let's hope for the best. We are just, in Science Research Foundation, we're just at the beginning of starting to combine therapies that individually do have some benefit on lifespan in mice and seeing whether we can get some kind of synergy, whether we can get more than the sum of the parts, so to speak. It remains to be seen.
Nice. The reason I ask that is because when I picture an engine of a car and maybe a car itself, um, I always think, yeah, but all these damages interact with each other. I mean, if you have a piece that is not working well, it will start damaging other things, and everything fall apart. And I love. I don't know if you're familiar with Bjorn Lomborg, who works on climate change,
A little bit.
and yeah, and his approach is to you also talked about that with aging, is to stress a priority list on where do you get the most bang for the buck, and then start working on that. And then I started to think, okay, so if we take your 7 categories and put them in a priority list, maybe you can know where to start working more first to then improve everything else. So that's why I asked
Yeah, so,
that.
so, so let me address that
Yeah,
directly because
yeah,
of
yeah.
course the thing is I want to emphasize how surprised I was at this, and I
Mhm.
don't think that it was because I missed something. I don't think I could have anticipated in advance
Mhm.
that the crosstalk was bigger than I would have expected, and similarly, I don't think now we can do that. I think for other categories.
Okay.
I think therefore the way to prioritize is not to prioritize the categories themselves in terms of their importance. I think the best way to prioritize is simply to make sure that we work on all of them. So, an organization
Mhm.
like SENS, for example, we prioritize on the basis of what other people are not doing because they think it's too hard or whatever, so as to make sure that the most difficult things catch up.
Yeah, I see. I wanted to talk to you now that we are talking about that list about mitochondrial engineering, right? I've seen when I was researching to talk about this to make this podcast that there was some controversies around that, and that you had some kind of clash with a guy who was saying that you cannot have a how do you call it, allotopic expression of the 13 coding regions of the mitochondria, right? Without basically, I mean, with preserving cellular functionality or something like that. And I started to understand. I started to dig in that, and I couldn't really understand his point. And I didn't know how long ago was this argument going on, and is that something of the past now, or and if yes, I seen that you made some progress and some proof of concept with mitosense, I think it's the name of the program, right? Can you talk a little bit about that, because that's something I've read here and there on the internet, and why Aubrey de Grey is he's some fantasy scientist, and his claims are just dumb and impossible. Can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, the main reason, according to me, why evolution did not finish the job of transferring mitochondrial genes to the nucleus is because the proteins that are encoded by the remaining genes are extremely hydrophobic, which
Mm,
means that they fold up into a very tight ball as soon as they are synthesized. So to step back a bit, because I've probably already jumped a little bit too far. So many of your audience may not
yeah,
know
yeah, sure,
that
sure.
mitochondria came into existence about 2 billion years ago by a process which was called the endosymbiotic event, in which a bacterium was engulfed, swallowed by another bacterium, a different type of bacterium. The bacterium that got swallowed was able to use oxygen for the extraction of energy from nutrients, using a process called oxidative phosphorylation. And the one that did the swallowing was not able to do that. But now it became able to do it by having this endosymbiont, as it's called, this bacterium living inside itself. However, it turns out that the process of oxidative phosphorylation is toxic, that there are byproducts that are created at a low but in a just unavoidable level, and these are called free radicals, and they are highly reactive. They damage other molecules. In particular, they damage DNA, which means that the DNA in the mitochondrion at this early point after the swallowing happened ended up mutating a lot. Now, during life, shit happens. Certain random things happen all the time, and evolution exploits that randomness, right? Mistakes in things. One thing that happens that's random is occasionally mitochondria just fall apart, just occasionally, and the mitochondrial DNA falls apart, and very occasionally bits of the mitochondrial DNA fall into the nucleus, and so it can get incorporated into the nuclear DNA. We know that this spontaneously happens occasionally, very occasionally, but of course when it does, then suddenly you've got two copies of the DNA, one in each of the two genomes, right? And the one that's in the one that has been accidentally copied over is no longer subject to the toxicity of free radicals, or at least to a much lower amount. So it has a better chance to survive. And you've got this redundancy, you only need one of the two to survive, so the one that's in the nucleus is the one that tends to survive. And so this is believed to be the basic process by which genes ended up being moved from one genome to the other. Okay, fine so far. But as we've seen, there are 13 genes that didn't move. And so, of course, everybody is interested to know why that should have been. And and it started out, people said, well, okay, yeah, I mean, it's basically because these proteins are really, really hydrophobic. Why does that matter? It matters because if a gene moves, then there's one thing that has to happen, which is that the protein, after it's been synthesized, needs to be imported back into the mitochondria, right? And the import process is quite tricky. It's quite well understood, but it's quite tricky, and it involves unfolding the protein and dragging it through as a linear chain of amino acids. And a hydrophobic protein, by definition, does not like to unfold. So it gets stuck in that machinery, in the import machinery. All right, so this kind of all makes sense. But then people started to notice that there were things that looked awfully like counterexamples to this, that are, very hydrophobic proteins, which are still, nuclear coded. They are actually their genes are in the nucleus, which is, it sounds like a falsification of this hydrophobicity hypothesis. And various people ran with this, and in particular, a guy named John Allen came up with a hypothesis back in the early 1990s, which basically said that actually we need certain genes to be in the mitochondrion because there is a subcellular non-uniformity of energy requirements. Just randomly because of nutrients and other things being randomly distributed, there's going to be variability within the cell, within a single cell, of how much energy is needed in a different place and this is best managed by being able to alter the expression of different genes in different parts of the cell, which of course you can't do if the gene is in the nucleus because the nucleus only has one genome. Right? You've only got one nucleus in a cell. You've got lots of mitochondria. Fine so far. But actually, this hypothesis, there's an awful lot of reasons to believe that this hypothesis can't possibly be right. First of all, you have to take into account the volatility of energy requirements. Yes, there may be variability across the cell, but that variability is going to change really fast. And, responding to it by, synthesizing new proteins, that's slow. It's inherently slow. So it seems like that's just not a mechanism that could actually address this problem, even if the problem exists. Second thing is that we already have mechanisms that do address this problem. In fact, the actual inherent mechanism of oxidative phosphorylation itself has kind of homeostatic negative feedback intrinsic to it. So the problem just kind of can't exist anyway. Plus, on top of that, there are various other mechanisms that are known that kind of make the thing even more responsive in a post-translational way. Nothing to do with creating new proteins. So the whole thing doesn't really work. Um, but still, if these counterexamples exist, then we've still got a problem. The thing is, though, if you look really hard, it turns out that they aren't counterexamples at all. They're perfectly good. They're perfectly consistent with the hydrophobicity hypothesis. So, for example, there is a family of proteins in mitochondria called the anion carriers. And these proteins are very hydrophobic and they're nucleocoded. But the thing is that they are imported by a new, completely separate process that is different from the process that imports things that have been transferred to the nucleus from the original primordial mitochondrion. Specifically, the ones that have been transferred into the nucleus from the primordial mitochondrion are imported all the way into the internal part of the mitochondrion called the matrix. So they are pulled through the two membranes of the mitochondrion. The anion carriers, on the other hand, they're pulled through the first membrane, the outer membrane, but then they just embed into the inner membrane and they are released from the import machinery by what's called lateral release. So they don't, in other words, you don't have to kind of make a hole through the inner membrane in order to import those proteins. And that means that you don't have the same hydrophobicity problem. The difficulty with hydrophobicity, the reason why the machinery has to unfold these proteins, is because the inner membrane has to get the proteins through without getting any protons through. Protons are, of course, much smaller than proteins, and they have to be kept out because that's how mitochondria work. So, so the anion carriers are not a counterexample at all. A lot of the other counterexamples in fact, the main other counterexample that was cited by people as a falsification of the hydrophobicity hypothesis was in chloroplasts, which are also subcellular machines in plants, of course, that were created by another endosymbiotic event, sometimes slightly more recently than mitochondria were. But chloroplasts have a somewhat different structure. In some ways, they're very similar to mitochondria, but not in all ways. And in particular, the hydrophobicity hypothesis just doesn't apply to them because their DNA is in a different place relative to the membrane that maintains a proton gradient and things like that. So so if you look at the details, if you don't try to oversimplify the biology, then actually the hydrophobicity hypothesis is perfectly fine. It's perfectly consistent with absolutely everything we know. So, but people don't listen very hard, and so by the time I started to realize all of this and realize that people had decided no, they like this subcellular thing instead, it had got really embedded as the mainstream hypothesis, and I had to go out and really strongly argue that this was all nonsense. I wrote a paper in, I'm going to say 2005, that goes into this in a lot of detail. It's in bioessays. And so, I went through all of the various so-called counterexamples and arguments against the hydrophobicity hypothesis and showed that those examples were not correct. But still, most people haven't even bothered reading that paper,
Mm-hmm. Do you consider like yourself like a hacker or something like that, trying to hack biology and do I don't know. You often talk about manipulating nature, but I see more of that like manipulating is kind of uh, uh, gentle, well, we are just manipulating here and then, but I see yourself more like someone who's uh, brute forcing nature and trying to get to the core of things and tweak them from the in the core. How do you see yourself in regards to that?
Yeah, I'm kind of halfway between the two, probably. I think, definitely for anyone who is a pioneering technologist, you are trying to take a system that you have a partial understanding of, and you have tools, ways to manipulate the system in certain limited senses, and you are looking for ways to, to combine what you have, what you know, and what you can already do to do something bigger, to do something more impactful. In biotechnology, that's true in a kind of perhaps a more extreme way than it is in other technologies, because the amount that we understand about the system we're trying to manipulate is so small, and the amount that we don't understand is so enormous. Um, but still, it's the same thing. And I guess the big other difference for biotechnology versus, well, for biomedical technology relative to other types of technology is that the body is working on our side. Yeah, in other words, we are fighting on the same side of the battle, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, I see.
The body has an enormous arsenal of inbuilt systems to try to keep itself healthy and to try to repair its own damage. And so we are kind of augmenting that. We are developing ways to repair the little bits of damage that the body does not already know how to repair. And thinking of it that way is very helpful, just from a mindset perspective for people like me. We are able to look at what's missing and kind of think about why it's missing. We can infer, we can draw conclusions from the fact that evolution has neglected this particular type of damage or that particular type, and we can ask, okay, how can we leverage that? And then, of course, a huge amount of biomedical technology revolves around just looking around at nature and seeing what nature has done, usually for completely different reasons than the reasons that we want. So, for example, CRISPR.
Mhm.
CRISPR has evolved in bacteria as a kind of the analog, the counterpart of our adaptive immune system in order to fight off bacterial viruses. And
Mhm.
it works pretty well for that purpose. But what we're using it for is a complete repurposing, right? And the brilliance of people like Jennifer Doudna and the others who pioneered all of this was to realize that the same system could be co-opted. And this is without really understanding how the system works.
Mhm.
I mean, we understand it at the top level. We understand there's this exonuclease called Cas9 that cuts DNA, and and the place and the location where it cuts is determined by the DNA of the thing that it's trying to destroy.
Mhm.
But exactly how the interactions work, those things are at the molecular and atomic level. Those are pretty subtle, but we don't really need to understand those things in detail. We just, it works, so we use it. We throw it in as a tool. That's how technologists think in general. And for pioneering, technology, you're trying to think constantly out of the box. So yeah, I mean, when I emphasize that I'm more of a technologist in my mind than a scientist, what I'm trying to emphasize there is that the technologists use the information they already have in a very different way than scientists use the information that they already have.
Mm.
Scientists are interested in understanding nature better, so they're coming up with new hypotheses. They're identifying things they don't understand yet. They don't know yet, and trying to find ways to ask nature the right questions. And so for a technologist, you're trying to use you're trying to identify cases where you already know enough to be able to do your manipulation. For a basic scientist, the concept of knowing enough just doesn't compute. I mean, really, I mean, because the knowledge is for its own sake, and the best questions are the ones whose answers give rise to more questions.
Yeah.
Which, again, for technologists, that doesn't compute.
Yeah, it makes me think about a question I wanted to ask you. When you talked about CRISPR and some repurposing of technologies and things like that, do you think that your work on, let's call them for the sake of this discussion, age-related diseases, uh, and I know you don't work on them directly, but do you think that the work on these categories you're working on could in the future lead to new medical research uh, domains, and where we could apply some of these findings to non-aging related diseases? Because I always think to myself, yeah, when you invent a new technology, if you look at the internet 20 years ago, you couldn't predict where we would be now. And often strong innovations in fields come from outside of the field themselves. They rarely come from inside, and then you apply them to different things. And I was I was thinking, okay, maybe one time, maybe when we fix, I don't know what category, we will discover that this mechanism is uh, not working as we predicted, and now we can apply this to many other diseases, and maybe we can prevent new diseases to appear with some of them and things like that. Do you think about it sometimes, or do you do you try to focus on aging and you don't care how things will be applied in the future? Because I feel that there is a huge potential here that we don't know, but that could be something very, very important. Because basically, if you fix damage, you could, maybe I'm totally wrong, and you could tell me that I'm wrong, but my intuition tells me, okay, if you can fix damage in the body, maybe a lot of other diseases are related to some kind of damage that we can also start thinking about fixing. Maybe there is some kind of bridge between these two worlds that we will discover later. How do you feel about that?
So broadly, I agree with that. So let us answer the question in two parts. So when I normally classify ways to be sick, which I often do in my
Yeah.
talks, the main thing that I am trying to get across in those parts of my talks is that it is counterproductive and wrong to regard the things that go wrong late in life as falling into these two categories, one of them being the diseases of old age and the other one being aging itself. That actually these are just parts of aging, and the difference between the two groups is only semantic. You know, the things that are called diseases, we just call them diseases, but they're just as much parts of aging as the things we don't. But the rest of those slides that I use in that part of the talk are about the things that are not age related. And I have two categories there. I say there's communicable diseases and there's congenital diseases,
Mhm.
right? So now, congenital diseases are typically very similar to age related diseases, just they happen early.
Yeah.
Because basically you've got something broken that is part of the inbuilt, natural, evolved damage repair machinery that the rest of us have. And that allows one particular type of damage to accumulate at a more rapid rate than it normally would, and therefore the person gets sick as a result. Now, these are actually very handy because they, at this stage in the development of the damage repair portfolio for aging, we need to develop these. It's a divide and conquer approach, as I always say. We need to develop these many different categories, different types of repair medicine. And in order to figure out whether we've succeeded, you know, whether these things are working, it's really handy to be able to apply them to people who only have that one type of damage
Mhm.
accumulating before they've got any of the other types to a significant degree. We can kind of, the signal to noise ratio is much better than it is if you're trying to treat people who have all these types of damage accumulating to a pathogenic level at more or less
Mhm.
the same time. So there, absolutely, the simple answer to your question that there is. I mean, I don't think about it as kind of the means to an end like that, but certainly the linkage is very tight. And this is what everybody's doing, not just in academia, but also in industry, because of course, you know, as the private sector emerges now and companies are forming, they need to figure out, they need to get, you know, regulatory approval for their things and so on. So that having the right patient group to start with to kind of prove that your thing actually is safe and effective, you know, it's very useful, and everybody's doing this. So then the other type of non-age related problem is communicable diseases, infections. And of course, it's a little bit oversimplified to say that these are not age related because in aging, people's immune system goes downhill. It doesn't
Well,
work as well.
you just have to see different reactions based on age to COVID, and you already know that something is going on, right? So,
Right. COVID is an extreme example, but it's
yeah,
true for most infections
yeah.
because the immune system works less well. So in that sense, you know, of course, there is also a linkage. But more than that, even if we think about the kinds of infections that are bad for young people, and you know, sometimes really bad. Like, I mean, as we all know, over the past 20 or more years, there have been other infections that nearly became pandemics,
Hmm.
right? And they often affected young people as well, okay,
Yeah.
quite badly. So there, it's more a case of the technology. So we've developed, for example, new types of vaccines, so mRNA vaccines, right? They're completely new, right? This is
Hmm.
the COVID is the first time that these things have really been used in earnest in anger, and they work incredibly well. And the technology that had to be developed to get these things to really work has been developed a lot faster than it would have been if it
Yeah.
hadn't been COVID, and it's been proven a lot faster. So now, people, the industry is geared up to be able to use that kind of technology for other infections much more rapidly, to be much more responsive.
Mhm.
Um, and there are other.
Was that, sorry to interrupt you, but was that due only to uh, funding? Or
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean,
okay.
I would say it more broadly. I would say it was due to incomplete recognition of how useful these things could be.
Mhm.
Um, and we can go further, like, for example, cancer. So, of course, almost all cancers are age related, and the work that's being done, whether it's on, like, uh, telomere based killing of cancers, or whether it's improving the immune system, it's mostly being done and developed in relation to cancers of old age. But it will be equally applicable to childhood cancers. So, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, definitely. Well, to answer your question in a kind of elevator pitch way, um, definitely all of the work that's going on in developing therapies against the health problems of late life will have plenty of applicability to the health problems of early life.
Okay, don't you think that talking sometimes? Sorry, but I didn't hear you a lot talking about this in your presentations. Don't you think that I also heard you that you were saying that you had to brand also your work and try to focus only on some aspects of it, and I understand that. Don't you think that there would be a much more? I mean, let's step back a little bit. Every time I speak about you to my friends and to and about your work and about aging and about maybe we could live to 1,000 years and things like that, almost everybody start laughing, right? That's the first reaction, and they think I'm crazy, and then I start showing them some of your videos and the interviews, and they start to understand a little better. But don't you think that would be a good entry way to a good way to pick interest to on? I don't know. I'm just brainstorming here, but I feel that there is a compelling side to what you just said. It's not only about fixing or ending aging. It's also probably going to improve everyone's quality of life uh, on the diseases on the disease way. I don't know how to phrase it, but don't you think it's very important also to talk about it more?
Mm, uh, it's a bit tangential. I mean, the thing
Mhm.
is, you know, really, nearly all um, of the sickness that we want to address in the industrialized world, anyway, is the health problems of late life. Vast majority of medical
Mhm.
expenditure,
Yeah,
of
true.
suffering, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, it's great that there will be side benefits,
Mhm.
for the health problems of early life, but I don't really see much value in talking about that, very conspicuously.
Yeah. Yeah, probably also because we are in a world where young life and I'd say diseases that you have early in life are pretty well treated in general. So maybe people don't really care about that too much. Maybe something like that. I wanted to talk to you about fasting. Okay, okay, because I've heard you several times and also on Joe Rogan and many other interview talk about how famine and caloric restrictions and things like that work well in short-lived animals, but a lot less in long-lived mammals and us, of course. I think still on this day we don't really um, uh, understand how fasting works too well and how efficient it can be on some pathologies, I think it's not well recognized yet, even though everyone and is talking about that. Of course, David Sinclair is talking about that. There is Walter Longo that made a lot of work on it, and many other scientists. But I think there is still a lot to learn about fasting, on the improvements you can get from it on your general health, let's say that like this. uh, but also I think, of course, it's less important than what we think, to related to aging. um, so I wanted to ask you, what do you think about all these let's say fast mimicking molecules and effects you can have on sirtuins that David Sinclair likes a lot, and uh, rapamycin, and of course metformin, and all this field that is developing about uh, uh, targeting aging with metformin, like the TAME study and resveratrol and things like that. I've been before I discovered you, I was thinking was taking resveratrol with NR, nicotinamide riboside, and things like that. And I still am. Sometimes I take some just like that for fun. Uh, I don't think it would hurt. It will hurt me. So at least that. Do you think it's a good thing to do that? Do you think uh, um, we should, waiting for you to fix aging, invest like some kind of money and energy trying to get some molecules? I was planning I'm 30 years old this year. I was planning to start metformin later in this decade, maybe at 35. Should I do it? If not, why? And yeah, can you just give me your opinion on that?
Okay, yeah. So, yes. So, to elaborate on the first part of what you said, yeah, there are very good evolutionary biology reasons to predict that long-lived species like humans will only get a much smaller benefit from calorie restriction than short-lived laboratory animals do. And indeed, this is what we see in the experiments that have been done. So, that means that we should not get overexcited about the potential of calorie restriction. Furthermore, this also applies to calorie restriction mimetics, so any kind of dietary supplement or whatever that somehow tricks the body into thinking that it is in a famine when it isn't. Um, and this certainly is, resveratrol is one of those things, so is metformin, so is rapamycin. Um, but but there are two things to say. First of all, even a small benefit is better than no benefit.
Mhm.
Every week of extra healthy life is a week worth having. So that definitely is worth bearing in mind. Second thing to bear in mind is that the benefits for health, the increasing healthy lifespan, are probably bigger in most species, and no reason to suppose it would not be true in humans, bigger than the improvement in total lifespan. Um, so, again, and especially because the benefits on healthy lifespan tend to be kind of making the body more robust, more willing, more able to cope with challenges, and challenges include not living right, having a diet that is bad in other ways, or not getting enough exercise or whatever, and a lot of
Mhm.
people are in that category. So so again, these things may have significant benefits, even if they're not going to make you live all that much longer. Um, and also, the big, big, big thing is we've already got these things. They already exist, these drugs, right? Or indeed, for that matter, just doing CR itself, or intermittent fasting, or whatever.
Mhm.
Whereas the technologies that I'm interested in developing that will really bring aging under proper medical control, they, rather conspicuously don't exist yet.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm all for this. I just, the only thing I ever say that is in any way negative about these things is to limit people's, monomania about them. To make
Yeah.
people not get the idea that this is all we need to think about.
Yeah, I see. Okay. A few more questions if you have a few minutes for me left.
Yeah.
I would like to, you often talk, and you and basically every anti-aging scientist talk about biological age in opposition to let's say, formal age, calendar age, or I don't know how you call it. Um, and there is something that I never got, and then maybe you can explain it to me. Uh, I hear, for example, David Sinclair say, "Yeah, I'm basically 10 years younger than my real age, biologically," and I heard you say almost the same a few times, and I get that. I mean, I understand how you can measure it, and I have done some research on what kind of different, let's say, indicators you measure, and of course, there are different methods, and all of them try to estimate based on different things. But how can you say biologically I'm 30 if you're 50, but what do you base the 30 on, since it's already wrong, since you basically you cannot say biological age is the only real thing and then say biologically I'm 30, because the 30 you're referring to is, it cannot be biological age. uh, so you cannot it's like a secular argument, you know. How do you base your biological age, how can you give a biological age if the calendar age is wrong? I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
uh
This is quite a simple thing to answer. So, um, yeah, chronological age, easy to understand, how long ago you were born. That's just straightforward.
yeah,
So, biological age is defined as the amount of damage that the average person with that chronological age has.
yeah, that's what I thought it was, but I still feel that like there is some, because again, if our health and the amount of damage slows, I think it does. It did last decades, because we improved our health in the, let's say, 30, 40 first years of our life, and I guess someone 40 today is younger biologically and average than someone 40 years old 100 years ago. Um, so does it mean that the biological age measure also shifts in time?
Yes, it does. Yes,
Okay.
yes, it does. But people normally ignore that simply because the that change is slow. So
Yeah.
and so everyone whom you might use to define the amount of damage that corresponds to a particular biological age, everyone there is about the same age already. Right, we're doing
Yeah.
those
Yeah. Yeah.
measurements now, so we kind of don't need to worry about the fact that if we had been defining biological age 100 years ago or 50 years ago, then it would have been different.
Sure, but when we will approach, let's say, the aging escape velocity, like you call it, this
That's
will
simple
tend
proof.
to infinity, right? It won't be any, there won't be any use of it anymore, right?
You're totally right. You're totally right. We need to define biological age once, like now.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I would like a fixed measure you can
That's right.
use in.
Yeah. Now, of course, the reason why people don't really worry about this very much at the moment is because at the moment our estimates of biological age are still pretty approximate.
Yeah,
Right? They're still pretty poor. So the definition of biological age is the amount of damage you have in your body,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And
Hmm.
and what we've been talking about so far is the calibration of that, the number that you assign, which
Hmm.
is defined in terms of chronological age, right? Um, but of course, most of the types of damage that matter, that whose eventual accumulation eventually leads to pathologies in late life, most of them we can't measure directly. We
Hmm.
have to like measure these proxies, these things that seem to be correlated with them.
Yeah.
And that's better than nothing, but we're still rather rapidly improving our ability to do that. So there will come a time, probably quite soon, probably the next few years, when this is kind of sufficiently stabilized, we're sufficiently good at measuring biological damage, that we can actually say, okay, we're going to call this the actual metric. We're going to call this
Okay.
biologically 30
Okay. Okay. I
forever,
see.
even if in the future most people who are 30 have less damage than that, and so
Yeah.
on.
Okay. I understand. Okay. That's what that always was a confusion to me because, of course, I thought about it's like IQ. You measure IQ, but the average IQ evolves with time. So then, what is an IQ yesterday is not the same in 20 years. So, okay. The last two things I wanted to talk to you quickly is. The first one is cryopreservation, right? I've heard you talk about it a few times, and it's not the same question as you always have that I will ask you. What I wanted to, I've heard you say basically we have a 50% chance that we will live 1,000 years and a 10% chance that we won't succeed in the next 100 years, right? Some things like that. Uh, if it's true, do you think there is a 100% chance we will manage to do it in the next 300 years or something like that? Can we just uh, is there a 1% chance we will never achieve it?
Yeah, technology doesn't really work that way. Right.
Yeah,
The probability distribution of over time, is a rather unusual one.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because, of course, the reason why something might take longer than you expect is because of unknown obstacles that you
Hmm.
come across.
Yeah.
And so, I can say the probability of reaching the Methuselarity in 15 years from now is 50%, according to my subjective estimate. But if we ask how the probability tails off after that, how it, or
Yeah.
rather, how it
Is
moves
it a
up
fat
towards 100.
tail distribution?
Very long tail. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I mean, the more problems you have, right, and the more you delay the result, the achievement of the result, the more time there is to have more problems, right?
yeah. But
So
yeah,
so I would say if we say the chance of getting there in 100 years is 90%, then I would say the chance of getting there in 200 years is about 91%.
yeah,
You
I
know,
see.
um, you know,
Okay.
it's like that. So yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I think we will eventually get to longevity escape velocity. I think the chance, you would in 1,000 years. I think the main reason why we would not get to longevity escape velocity would be like humanity was annihilated,
Yeah.
rather than there were still problems. Um,
Yeah.
but still, we just don't know. I mean, so this is an example of why I never really think very much about the long term. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. Also.
I'm a first things first kind of guy.
Yeah, and so the argument with yeah, there might be unknown obstacles is also reversible. You can say yeah, but maybe there will be unknown solutions that will show up and everything speeds up very quickly and in 5 years we're there and you don't know. So the reason why I was talking about that is should I cryo preserve myself in the hope that in 300 years it's almost certain we will be there and I will be revived and know my grandchildren, or should I just don't care about that and cross fingers and hope we reach it before I die?
Well, so of course, at the moment, a huge part of the answer to that question revolves around the quality of cryopreservation. In other words, the amount of additional damage that is done to your body in the process of taking you down into liquid nitrogen temperature, on top of the damage that already existed that made the doctor say that you were dead, right? Um, Now, there is progress there. There is a lot of work going on. Well, not a lot, not nearly enough actually, but some work going on trying to improve the quality of cryopreservation to reduce greatly the amount of damage done.
Mhm.
Now, so let us assume that this work is successful soon, okay, in time for you and me, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Then, and yet also let's assume that my work is not it does not succeed soon, and so
Mhm.
we need to be cryopreserved. Then the way I look at it is the same way that I would look at medical care for people who are in hospital for a very long time, especially people who are unconscious in a persistent vegetative state and so on. So most people say, yeah, I mean, occasionally these people wake up, and therefore, we really totally ought to be keeping them alive as best we can, and keeping someone cryopreserved is exactly the same as that.
Mhm. True, I didn't see it like this, but it's very true. So basically, you say maybe it's a personal question, but would you cryo preserve yourself?
Oh, totally. I've been signed up with Alcor since,
Okay.
well, nearly 20 years now.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I mean, I think it's perfectly obvious that it's a sensible thing to do for one's health.
And do you think that someday you will be woke up to see uh, all the magnificent things that you started with your research, and people will raise you from the dead and cheer on you? Thank you for everything. Here is you. Maybe you will
What?
receive then post death but alive Nobel Prize. Uh,
Yeah, like I say, I don't think about the distant future very much.
yeah, yeah, I see. The last thing I wanted to ask you, a few days ago, I did bring my cat to the vet because she had a problem with her eyes, and a retina that just broke, and now she has a blind eye. And the guy did a blood test. A few hours later, he told me, wow, she has the blood of a 5 years old cat when she's 15. She will probably live 10 more years. And when he told me that, I smiled because, of course, I thought about this conversation we would have today. And already my vet was telling me, well, if you showed me her blood test, I would say she's way younger than what she is. So basically, already confirming that biological age is very uncorrelated with chronological age. And then I started thinking, imagine a world if you succeed, and then the technology you developed is very cheap and very affordable for everyone. Is there a world where I keep my pets forever, and then
Maybe.
every question that go with that?
Maybe. So it is more difficult to achieve longevity escape velocity for short-lived species than it is for long-lived species. Because the reason a species is short-lived in the first place is because it's in its natural inbuilt damage repair machinery has bigger gaps in it. It's less
Mhm.
comprehensive than ours is, right? Which means
Okay.
there's more gaps that we have to fill. Now, on the other hand, the gaps that a short-lived species has that a long-lived species doesn't have are, by definition, things that we do have, and so we can copy long-lived species somewhat
Mhm.
to get them to help the short-lived species. But that's kind of not. That's kind of what I just said is not really so true as all that. So we can look, for example, at the situation with birds. Birds tend to live a lot longer than mammals, even if you factor out body size, for example, and that's despite the fact that birds consume more energy than mammals because they fly. You know, flying is hard work.
Mhm.
Um, so we've looked at this. I mean, when I say we, biologists have looked at this, right? And we kind of understand that this is because birds have evolved a cleaner respiratory chain. So their oxidative phosphorylation machinery in their mitochondria does not make so many free radicals as in mammals. And we don't understand the details of how that has happened. But of course, it's to do with the subtleties of the evolution of the proteins that are involved in oxidative phosphorylation. So, if we could understand, you know, what the differences are, then maybe we could kind of put birds' um, machinery into the mammalian body, even into the human body,
Mhm.
and maybe it would work better. But the thing is, it's got to fit with the rest of the human stuff. So you have to decide where to stop, right? You put one protein in, it doesn't kind of juxtapose properly with the ones that are from the human. So you have to put the ones that it juxtaposes within as well. But then
Mhm.
you have to put the ones that juxtapose with those, and eventually you're a bird, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It may not be so easy to copy the long-lived solution into the short-lived solution. However, um, dogs and cats are probably just about on the boundary there. You know, we care about them a lot, and they live a lot longer than mice already,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So we might be able to get to longevity escape velocity for them.
It's been a real pleasure for me to talk to you. I I love your work. I think you're a fantastic thinker, and I thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much. It's
Thank you very
been
much.
great fun. Bye bye.
Bye.